Hello, I'm Stephen Matchett from Campus Morning Mail, and this is Expert Opinion, where we ask education experts who know what is going on, what's going on. Expert Opinion is brought to you by Twig Marketing, Australia's original higher education marketing consultancy. Got a brand issue or a message that isn't getting out there? Talk to Tim Winkler, tim@twigmarketing.com. And thanks to producer Amanda Johnson from Twig, who makes Expert Opinion happen. In 2020, La Trobe University contemplated cutting courses in Greek and Hindi and Indonesian due to a lack of student demand. In the end, the following year, Greek and Hindi survived after vigorous protests from local communities. But Indonesian didn't. The result is one less opportunity for Australians to learn the language of our largest near neighbour. It's a problem few Asian language lobbies want to talk to CMM about, but fortunately, Liam Prince does. Mr. Prince is director of the Australian Consortium for In-Country Indonesian Studies. That's RCHIS to its friends, and that's based in Perth. Good morning, sir. Thank you for sparing the time. I know how busy you are.
Oh,
Liam,
my pleasure, Stephen.
Liam, last year you wrote that, and I quote you, some portion of the Australian population learning Indonesian and getting to know Indonesia better is necessary to Australia achieving what Paul Keating famously described as a sense of security in Asia, not from Asia. So I don't think that's going real well. I've seen figures that put the number of students studying Indonesian across the country at a couple of thousand. What's Acichis's perspective on Australians' interest in Indonesia?
Yeah, well, the figures don't look good and haven't looked good for about 20 years, Stephen. The decline has been quite substantial. When I started learning Indonesian back in 1998 here at UWA, there was something like 2,000 students around the country studying Indonesian at university level. And as of the most current figures we've got from the Department of Education in 2020, that figure is down to about 700 students. So that's a pretty dramatic decline at a university level, and that's echoed in the school sector as well, where we have about the same number of students, about between 700 and 800 students studying Indonesian at year 12 level, and that's down from about 1,100 students a decade ago, and probably more like 2,000 students nationally 20 years ago. So the figures aren't great.
And yet you run an in-country placement program that seems to me to be very popular.
Well, there are contradictory trends going on, but they're fairly explainable. I mean, the boom in-country study and the boom in in-country study over the last 10 years has been due to Commonwealth funding of the new Colombo Plan. And that explains why a program like Acichis's has flourished over the last 10 years. And we've actually gone from a decade ago, maybe sending 100 to 150 Australian students up to Indonesia for university study each year, to just before the pandemic, sending about 500 students a year. So, that's a quintupling of our student numbers, and the overall student numbers of Australian students going to Indonesia for study have gone from it being a really boutique niche endeavour of some 300 to 400 students nationally going up to Indonesia to just before the pandemic, over 2,000 Australian students heading up to Indonesia for study in that year.
Tell me, what do you do? Why does it work?
Well, I'd like to say it's because Acichis's is incredible and we offer great quality programs, but the reality is it has been choices by the Commonwealth Government about where to invest funding. And so over the last, in the 7 years prior to the pandemic, between 2014 and 2020, let's say, the Australian government invested something like $320 million in the new Colombo Plan to put money into incentivising Australian undergraduate students to go to the Indo-Pacific for their university study. By contrast, there hasn't been funding for the learning of Asian languages in schools since 2012, but properly since 2002, when the Commonwealth Government wound up a thing called the National Asian Languages and Studies in Schools strategy, or NALSIS, in 2002. It was brought back in a slightly anemic form in 2009 by the Rudd government, but was then discontinued in 2012. So, and since 2012, there's been no money in the system, no money provided to schools for the teaching of Asian languages. So we have this kind of slightly inconsistent funding of a educational pipeline to produce Asia literate Australian graduates. So yeah, as you say, for the last 7-8 years, the funding for in-country study and for sending Australian undergraduates has been wonderful, fantastic, world-beating, the best we've ever had. But at the same time, we've had zero funding almost for schools to teach Asian languages.
Come to that in a minute. Just tell me a little bit about how your program works.
As in a potted history of teachers?
Well, potted history of its operation.
Sure. Well, I mean, it was set up in the mid-90s. It grew out of the Indonesian studies departments around the country. And it was set up to with a little bit of seed funding from the Commonwealth Department of Education. And it was established to overcome what was then kind of bureaucratic immigration and pastoral care obstacles to sending Australian university students, safely up to Indonesia for periods of study that could be credited back to their degrees back here in Australia. And it was recognised that that was a difficult thing to do, and given the volume of students, the small number of students in any given year that wanted to do that, it didn't make sense for any single Australian university to try and build that infrastructure and manage that process. So my predecessor in this role, a guy called Professor David Hill, who was then Professor of Southeast Asian Studies at Murdoch, got together with colleagues around the country to set up a national mechanism for managing that process and for creating a pastoral care infrastructure up in Indonesia that could look after the Australian students once they're up there. And by and large, with the brief hiatus of the 2-year pandemic we've just been through, that is Achichas's bread and butter, is sending Australian students up for in-country study and looking after them while they're there. So
how many universities do you send students to?
So we're a consortium we were before the pandemic, 25 universities, 23 Australian and 2 international universities that then also partner with and place students with 10 partner universities up in Indonesia.
Okay. And what does the program entail when kids go? Well, young people, I'm sorry, go there.
Yep. So again, when Achichas first began, its sole function was really drawing students from the Indonesian language departments in Australia around the country and sending those students for in-country language study and for long duration study, so semester and full year study. And for the first 10 years of the organisation, that's pretty much all it did. By about 2002, it was recognised that the writing was on the wall already around enrolments in terms of Indonesian language students around the country, and that those were declining. That if the organisation, if Achichas had a future, it was going to be in drawing students from other parts of the Australian student population and to with some other kind of hook to get them interested and into Indonesia. So in 2002, it was the first time Achichas experimented with different disciplines. So with some funding from the Maya Foundation then, we designed and launched a journalism program, a journalism professional practicum it was called, and it was both an innovation in terms of discipline. It was journalism, not Indonesian language specific, but also format. So it was a practicum, it was a 6-week program that had language study built into it, and some students would go up over the summer, the Australian University summer, do 2 weeks of intensive language and industry seminars, learning about the Indonesian media sector, and then do a 4-week professional placement. And that gave us a different template for a program and also drew students from another part of the Australian student population. And that template we've then built out to encompass a really large range of disciplines now. So, and that process of diversification really got a shot in the arm, a big shot in the arm, from 2014 onwards, with the launch of the new Colombo plan. So since then, we've built out practicum programs in disciplines like development studies, business, law, creative arts and design, tourism and agriculture. So we now offer a full suite of programs in a range of different disciplines and also formats.
Okay. It's paradoxical. I mean, I think Indonesia is the second largest destination for Australian overseas travellers. It's a country we are not unfamiliar with, or bits of it, and yet there appears to be no interest in engaging.
It's probably putting it a little bit starkly. I think you have to look at where the interest lies. I think. But you're right to characterise the nature of the relationship is sort of patchy and confined to certain segments. So, I mean, look, having 1 million, again, pre-pandemic, but having 1 million Australians go up to Indonesia for recreation and holidays, not a bad thing. And I think both countries, you know, accept that that's a great thing to have happen. But it does mean that the general Australian public's experience of Indonesia is very localized to, say, Bali, and to treating it as a tourist destination rather than, I guess, a kind of a peer country, you know, to be related to. I think, and look, far more qualified people than me, like our, you know, friends at the Lowy Institute who do the polling on public opinion of Australian public opinion towards Indonesia, can drill down into, you know, what the layers of Australian public opinion towards Indonesia are and how it has changed over time. I think obviously there are bits of the Commonwealth government particularly that have a big interest in seeing the relationship with Indonesia improve and thicken and diversify. And within that context, obviously DFAT and the new Colombo plan is a pretty big intervention into building that relationship. So again, you know, that's a $300 million and counting investment in ensuring that in thickening those ties, you know, amongst initially Australian students, but the hope is as they go through their career that we'll see them building careers out of those formative experiences. That's the bet, right? That's the bet that the Australian government's placing. Now, I think Achichis is a little bit ahead of the game in the sense that we were doing this back in, you know, from 1994, 95 onwards. So we have an alumni cohort, which is still modest, but, you know, we've got now close to 4,000 people that have been Australian students that have been through Achichis programs. And many of those alumni going back to, you know, 20, 25 years now are now mid career and building careers that are Indonesia or Southeast Asia focused out of those formative experiences. So I think, you know, we're a pretty good case study.
Sorry, it sounds like in terms of the numbers that say DFAT and defence need in terms of fluent Indonesian speakers, but also people who understand Indonesian culture, that specific government need might be being met?
Yeah, well, I think, you know, if you're talking about there only being 700 Australian students studying Indonesian nationally, and that's at all year levels. So if you think about the number of students who are making it to third year or even to honours, you know, talking more like 100 to 150 students. And I would say at that level, though I don't know, you need to talk to colleagues in government, but I think at that level, you're probably getting to a mission critical level where you're not getting enough graduates with high-level language skills or cultural agility, knowledge of Indonesia, to even fill the current requirements in Commonwealth government, you know, within defence, within DFAT, within some of the intelligence agencies, within any of the other Commonwealth agencies that are external facing or might have dealings with Indonesia. So I would suspect if I was in Commonwealth government, I would be worried that we're not getting that quality. And it's also, it is a numbers game. You're talking about a talent pool, right? So if back 20 years ago, we had 2,000 graduates a year, let's say, with third year into it, it wouldn't be that, but let's say we have, I don't know, 15 to 100 or so, making it all the way to third year in Indonesian, you've got such a bigger talent pool for those government departments to choose from. But even if setting aside just maintaining the status quo, the ambition should be, and rhetorically is, that we want to be building a better relationship with Indonesia, a stronger relationship. We don't want to do what we've been doing. We want to actually, broaden and thicken the relationship. And to do that, we need some pretty highly trained talent to be doing that and overcoming that. And the reality is we're not doing that. We're going backwards.
So that goes to what you described as cultural agility. We just need a massive, a lot more people who've got an awareness of Indonesia, a broad understanding of culture, and just, no, I don't represent it in Australian discourse, but speak for it and understand it.
It's all of those things. Look, I think we can get fixated in this conversation about language ability. I think language is really important. Like, I mean, to become not just conversationally, but to cultivate as a practitioner, you know, as someone and a language student, you know, it requires a lot of investment. It is like learning a musical instrument. You need people who are practicing it and really committed to cultivating a high level proficiency in Indonesian. Now, but more than that, it's about what language enables. It's about networks of trust and trusted relationships, right? So, I mean, the power, I think, of student mobility, of having undergraduate students go to Indonesia and learn Indonesian and be there at that critical time in their formation. The reason that's so powerful, and I guess why DFAT wants to harness that, is you're never more open to the world, really, and never less encumbered by, you know, I don't know, family obligation or the strictures of, say, professional allegiance, or all of those things that start to harden into this kind of carapace as you go through life. For most people, you're never more open to true sort of peer-to-peer relations than in that moment of sort of being at, say, at university, a young person who's not yet fully formed. And I think, so that's why it's so powerful, I think, for it to have Australians go sort of sojourn in a place like Indonesia at that time.
I have a very old friend who, well, she's not old, but she's been a friend for a long time, who wanted to become an Indonesian correspondent for a news organisation. And so she went and learned Indonesian. She was a highly qualified journalist, but she went and learned it and just immersed herself in the culture. And I think it probably influenced and shaped her reporting for a long time, just that capacity to exist in the culture. I mean, we can't just fly in and fly out.
No, I mean, I think, you know, I mean, I don't want to make Indonesia a special case. I think relationships of trust and understanding are important in all areas of human relations, no matter what country you're from.
But they are just up the road, brother.
Who, Indonesia?
Yeah.
Well, I think geographically that's correct, but the paradox of Australia-Indonesia relationships is that one of geographic proximity, but extreme cultural distance. And that's what those of us working in this area, I mean, it's both the thrill and the interest level of it. It's just trying to resolve that paradox. It's just incredible. Part of resolving that paradox is building those networks of people to, you know, those kind of phrases of people-to-people relationships. But what are we talking about? We're talking about, you know, friendships and collegial relationships, relationships of trust that you can eventually, over time, place important things on, you know, investment on, or you know, trust in a professional sense, in careers. You know, these are things that require, just a basis of trust, and language proficiency is a way of getting there, one way, at least, one element, and I would argue a necessary element, in order to get to that firm basis of trust where we might engage with Indonesia and trust doing business with Indonesia in a way that we're currently not doing. And again, the fact is we're not actually improving at the moment as a country on that. We are going backwards.
So the universities who are looking to China and wondering whether the demand will continue for student placements, Monash has opened in Jakarta, and it's a Monash campus. USQ, Central Queensland University, CQU, has got a presence there and is building on it. I think it's looking for a campus in a big provincial centre, the name of which escapes me. But is that going to, you know, people have hopes that it will become a market for an international education, whether we go to there or they come to us, probably us going there to more. Have we got the intellectual infrastructure in place to make even that happen?
Well, it's happening in terms of Monash, and I think I mean, I can't speak for everyone around the country, but I think anyone that cares about Australia-Indonesia relations, and particularly educational relations, have their heart in their mouth and, you know, are praying that the Monash experiment works. Everybody wants that to go well. It's the first really substantial Australian university investment in terms of bricks and mortar presence in Indonesia, probably ever, but at least that I can remember, and that's been provided for by the signing of the IATEPA agreement, and huge amount of work in negotiating the barriers that have prevented that. So I think, I would imagine the Australian universities are sitting around and watching to see how that goes. And so we can only hope that that goes really, really well, and that Monash isn't, and then CQU is not aren't the only Australian universities heading into Indonesia. From my perspective, it'd be wonderful to see more Australian universities going in a big way in Indonesia.
But inevitably, that's going to take time. I mean, you just do not arrive in a neo-colonial sense and just set up shop. You've got to win trust and support. Their education system must be looking slightly askance at us.
I think that was definitely one of the big barriers, was a degree of protectionist sentiment from the Indonesian universities, and you know, not. I mean, this is this is where understanding comes in. I mean, you used the word, you know, neo-colonial. If you don't understand the last 70 years of Indonesian history, it's really hard to understand why there might be a legitimate case and a legitimate anxiety about, you know, a country like Australia wanting to get into that market and set up shop. And if you don't understand, you know, that the Australian higher education system is an incredibly different beast to the higher education in Indonesia, which is set up still with universities as public institutions, not really commercial outlets. We've just been through, what, 30 years of commercialisation, of corporatisation of the higher ed sector here in Australia. So they're very different systems, and there can be rightly some anxiety about those systems meeting. That said, let me also just say, Monash has gone in, great. Monash is probably the only university, you know, incredibly well-resourced and, dare I say, deep-pocketed, can probably afford to take the kind of risk and the swing of setting up, being the first cab off the rank in terms of setting up a campus in Indonesia, and great. But look at who was driving that. You know, that's Andrew McIntyre there at Monash, and he has pursued that dream of setting up a campus in Indonesia through I don't know how many different Australian institutions, because of his deep connection with Indonesia and the ability to speak Indonesian, and his networks in Indonesia. You know, that's been a lifelong project. But that is, you know, I would see Andrew as somebody as, you know, a great example of someone who has invested in building his own personal knowledge of and understanding of Indonesia, and that's had. And he's carried that through a career, and that's now paying off for Monash and also for the country, you know, for Australia's relationship with Indonesia. And we need more people like Andrew McIntyre.
And so say all of us. What do we do in the whole idea of trying to build an interest in the country through kids now at school? If they don't want to study it, they don't want to study it. And if they don't know much about it, what can be done?
Well, a good starting point might be to look at what we've done in the past that worked, and as a starting point, do that again before we get too carried away with what else we might do. So if we go back to what we did in the mid-90s and the early 2000s, if we go back to NALSIS, the National Asian Languages and Studies in Schools strategy that was designed in large part by Kevin Rudd out of state government in Queensland, driven by the Goss government and through COAG, and signed off by Paul Keating as Prime Minister. That allowed for investment of $30 million a year in incentivising Australian schools to set up Asian language programs in what was then identified as 4 key Asian languages, which were Japanese, Mandarin Chinese, Indonesian and Korean. That's $30 million in over the 8 years that program was in effect, and a total investment of over $300 million in today's dollars. So roughly the same amount of money, incidentally, that's been spent on the New Colombo plan. And that provided money at a school level that, you know, school heads, principals could could access, could apply for, to take a chance and to risk adding an Asian language to the roster. So say a language was teaching French or French and Italian, they could apply for this pot of Commonwealth funding to then add, say, Indonesian or Mandarin Chinese. And that program, NAUSIS in particular, was incredibly effective. So we know from the first 3 years of NAUSIS, between 95 and 97, there was something like a 44% increase in the number of government schools offering an Asian language. And the number of students in government schools studying an Asian language jumped by 60% in just the first 3 of those 8 years of NAUSIS. You know, here in WA, what NAUSIS meant was we went from having something like, 15 schools teaching Indonesian. By the end of NAUSIS, we had something like 35 schools in WA teaching Indonesian, instead of having, maybe 60 students a year matriculating to year 12 with Indonesian. We had 350, and that was kind of replicated around the country because we had that funding. In Western Australia now, we're back down to having something like 12 schools teaching Indonesian, and we're lucky in a good year to have 70 students matriculating.
So the program expired, and what, the Howard government didn't renew?
Yeah, so the program got to the end of its second quadrennium and was not funded for what was intended to be a third quadrennium, by the Howard government in 2002. And it wasn't until there was a change of government and it was reinstated in the middle of the GFC as the NAUS program, the National Asian Languages and Studies in Schools program, or NAUSP, under the Rudd government. But it was only funded about half the amount. So it was then $15 million a year rather than $30 million a year. And then that went up till 2012 and then wasn't renewed under the Gillard government.
So what can universities do? I mean, is it possible to just create some level of demand for starters in first year undergraduate?
Look, I think it's really difficult. I think it's difficult for the universities to move alone. I think the issue is upstream in schools, and that I think absent an injection of government funding, the numbers aren't going to turn around in any large sort of systemic way. I think the reality is there isn't a huge amount of organic demand in the Australian public for the learning of Indonesian language, either from students or from parents. And that's just a reality that has to be faced. That in itself is the base foundational question. And the only time in the history of kind of Australian public policy and education that the numbers have really moved has been when there has been a concerted effort from government. So government has always been ahead of where the Australian public is. And perhaps that's the major danger, or it's just that affecting cultural change and having government drive that cultural change takes a long time and probably takes a lot of resources.
And now, there's no migrant community to drive it.
Well, that's the other thing, right? So Indonesian, almost alone amongst those key Asian languages that NAUSIS targeted, doesn't have a diasporic community behind it. And so it is tricky. It is kind of unique in the sense of being a language in the old language, a language of external significance that DFAT certainly cares about and other departments of the Commonwealth government care about, but it isn't underwritten. It isn't a community language or a largely spoken community language. I think the census data that came out a few weeks ago showed there was something like 70,000 people who reported speaking Indonesian at home. So that's the kind of size compared to something like Mandarin, where you've got over 600,000 people speaking Mandarin at home in Australia. So yeah.
So it really is down to government. There's no other way.
I think, well, I mean, I guess there could be an immigration strategy. It's definitely outside my remit and pay grade, probably. I mean, one could, I mean, I mean, looking at some of the diasporic communities that are underpinning other languages like Mandarin, and we saw Punjabi and Nepali. Some of these diasporic communities have grown up very quickly over the last 20 years. So it's not inconceivable that 20 years hence there's a really large Indonesian-speaking community in Australia driving it. But even I don't think that would do it, because what you're talking about is infrastructure. You're talking about language programs in schools and then on in universities, and we don't have like, for instance, Vietnamese is what, the second or third most spoken language other than English in Australia, and there's only a handful of schools around the country that are teaching Vietnamese. It's not taught in a systemic way in Australia, either at school or university level. So I think there has to be, I think there's no way around there being some level of government investment in driving that capability and driving the study of a language like Indonesian.
Questions for the new minister? Questions worth asking for the foreign minister and the education minister. Indeed, and at the state level, I think as well. I think that's always been the tricky thing, is that the bits of government that see the benefits of this, of creating a really solid pipeline of Australian students studying languages of external significance, like Indonesian, is that they're largely, by and large, Commonwealth departments, and but it's the state governments that have the most of the responsibilities for education, particularly at the school level, which is where the problem is. Liam Prince, look, thank you for sparing the time. I know you're busy, and it's been fascinating. I could talk to you a great deal longer. In fact, we'll get you back if you would. One of the joys about this job is talking to people who really know what's going on about important issues. Thank you very much, sir. That's been that's been Expert Opinion from Campus Morning Mail with Liam Prince, and we're out.